I've had the distinct pleasure of going through the Penn Chief Learning Officer doctoral program alongside today's guest, Dr. Lucrecia Grandolini, and I'm truly beyond excited to spend the next 40 minutes with her. Lucrecia is one of those rare leaders who brings both deep intellectual rigor and real-world impact to everything she does. With over 15 years of global experience spanning financial services, management consulting, and clinical psychology, she operates at the intersection of leadership, organizational transformation, and human well-being, helping leaders and organizations navigate complexity in ways that are both strategic and deeply human. She currently works as a leadership advisor and consultant, partnering with senior leaders to build adaptive capacity in fast-moving, uncertain environments. Her perspective is shaped by an incredibly rich career, from serving as global head of learning at Investec to consulting at Deloitte in London, to her early work as a clinical therapist in Buenos Aires. Lucrecia is also a contributing author to the newly released book, Leaders as Architects of Change, co-authored by Dr. Ragu Krishnamoorthy, director of the Penn CLO doctoral program, and Dr. Sharon Ravitch, professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania. This book brings together groundbreaking scholar-practitioner research designed to help leaders rethink how they lead in today's rapidly changing world. And Lucrecia's chapter is a standout, especially in how it challenges us to design organizations for uncertainty rather than control. Her work pushes beyond traditional leadership models and introduces new ways of thinking about adaptability, complexity, and what it truly means to lead when the future is no longer predictable. And my name is Dr. Jennifer Neumaier. I am also a graduate of the Penn CLO program. Lucrecia, it is such a joy to have you here today, and I'm so happy to be the host of this episode on the Practitioner Scholar.
It's my pleasure, Jen, to be here today.
Wonderful. Well, Lucrecia, let's dive right in, because so much of your work centers around a theme that every leader is grappling with right now, including myself, and that is uncertainty. So my first question for you today is, a lot of your work, Lucrecia, and what you have written about is around uncertainty. So why uncertainty?
Thank you, Jen. That's a great question. Why uncertainty? At the heart of it is one of our deepest human struggles. We struggle with not having control over things. We want to hold on to something. And yet at the same time, uncertainty, not knowing, is what makes life interesting, exciting, even beautiful. So uncertainty have this type of two phases. One that we're drawn to, the suspense of a story, not knowing what the conversation would lead, not knowing how the novel would end, if our favorite team is going to win the game. That's exactly what keeps us engaged, what keeps us reading and watching. In those moments, we feel alive. Those moments invite connection, creativity, imagination. They connect us with possibilities. But uncertainty has also another phase, a deeply unsettling one. When you think about, would I have a job at the end of this restructure? Do I still matter in this relationship? Am I still relevant after this AI transformation? That kind of uncertainty triggers something very different. It triggers something very primal in all of us. It becomes around anxiety, fear. It's no longer about possibility. It's about survival. So that's why uncertainty fascinates me, because it sits at this tension between growth and fear, between possibility and threat, between expansion and contraction. And we see this in organizations all the time. We see the sudden change in leadership, the merger that no one saw coming, the quiet resignation that changes everything. And people struggle with these changes, mostly because they are struggling to understand what this means to them. So uncertainty is not just a strategic issue, it's a deeply human, deeply personal one. And another misconception around uncertainty is that we think it's an episodic. It's a moment in time, something that would disappear, a disruption that will go away. But actually uncertainty is part of today's landscape. So what we need to change is the question. It's not longer how can I minimize or avoid uncertainty. The question, the real question we need to ask ourselves is how can I relate to uncertainty differently? Because if we change the question, we'll connect with all of those opportunities that uncertainty allows us to have.
Thank you, Lucrecia. I'm grappling with that uncertainty as well, with all of the demands that are sitting on top of all of us as leaders, as individual contributors, with everything that is changing, with the influence of AI, and how are we incorporating that into our work? And is that going to change how I work? Many folks are grappling with the same concerns around that uncertainty. And I'd be remiss not to mention things that are going on from a global perspective, from a political standpoint. Everyone is feeling something very specific to them. And then additionally to that, what is happening as they're showing up with their own job responsibilities every day? And that uncertainty is showing up. It's showing up in how we bring our best selves to work. It's showing up in how we interact with our friends and our family. And there's greater repercussions that are happening beyond just what's sitting in front of us. So I thank you for sharing that. And what it's bringing up for me are those similar questions. You write, Lucrecia, you write about the end of the plan, predict, control paradigm. So share with me a little bit more about what is changing, and perhaps you're validating what I'm seeing that's changing as well.
Yeah, sure. Look, for a long time, leadership was built on a simple premise, a simple promise, a kind of actually seduction. The fact that if we plan well enough, if we manage tight enough, we can control the outcome. And that made leaders feel under control. It gave a sense of mastery. And that worked. It worked quite well. Why? Because for the last century, the environment was stable, the pace of change was slower, and things were more predictable. So organizations could behave like machines. They could set goals, they could execute plans, and then they could measure and control the outcomes. But we no longer live in this predictable world, as you would, know. So what actually is changing is the environment, and is putting into question this blueprint that we have created for leaders. The leadership today is asked something quite different. Is asked to be in the present moment, to adapt and adjust to what's unfolding. And how do we know that? Because plans become obsolete the moment we publish them, because leaders and teams long for a type of certainty that never fully arrive. And the leader needs to project this confidence and certainty that they actually don't feel. So what happens? Anxiety starts to build up. And what happens when anxiety builds up? Control goes up in the way of more approvals, more governance, more processes, more bureaucracy. And the real cost of all of this is not just efficiency, it's psychological safety. Because trust becomes too road. People become more cautious, they stop speaking up, they stop challenging assumptions. And in a complex, fast-moving world, that's the quickest way of losing adaptability. You lose your competitive edge by tightening control. So leadership today is not about having all the answers all the time. It's about creating the conditions where people can come together, to think together, to explore uncertainty as a positive force, and to collectively allow the intelligence of the room to emerge.
What you just shared about psychological safety, for me and for many others, that's actually been the premise of our program, is creating the conditions for people to communicate, to learn, to trust, to gather, to share. That has been, for me, one of the most compelling aspects of the program that we have gone through, because so much of that learning, by having that psychological safety in the program and in organizations, allows us to thrive and is shown in organizations to help organizations be innovative, positively correlate to organizational outcomes and productivity and most importantly, revenue generation. And so I echo the sentiment that you shared around psychological safety. Is without that, with all of the constraints that are sitting on us as people within organizations, without the psychological safety, there's such a detriment in our ability to bring our best selves in, contribute in ways that's meaningful, and do the good work that we're looking to achieve, not only in our personal lives, but in our professional lives. This actually ties very nicely in to the next question that I have for you. In the chapter that you wrote, Lucrecia, you introduced the metaphor of the living iceberg to refer to organizations. And there's been a lot of metaphors over my career and yours that talk about icebergs, but this is something different. Why the image, Lucrecia, of the living iceberg?
That's a great question, Jen. Thank you. Well, as you well said, it's not a new metaphor. It's been around for a long time, but it's still so relevant. I think that it beautifully captures something that we often miss when we think about organizations. The fact that the most powerful is the less visible. When we think about organizations, when we talk about organizations, we normally refer to the things that we can name, we can see, we can point to. The strategy decks, the transformation roadmap, the KPIs, the annual report that's in the website, right? That's the visible layer of an organization. And that sometimes gives us the illusion that organizations are fully knowable. But actually, like an iceberg, beneath the waterline sits a much larger, much powerful system. And that's the unwritten rules. Those are the things that the assumptions, the beliefs, the norms around, is it safe to speak up in this organization? What does it really take to succeed here? Do I really belong? What's the story people carry around what it matters here and what it doesn't? What can be said and what actually can never be said? And this invisible force is what actually determines if change can be successful. Because we can have fancy tools, we can have the best change plan, but if what sits underneath the waterline, if the norms, the beliefs, the assumptions don't support that change, the transformation, change would rarely stick. So you can introduce the new framework, the new structure, the best change roadmap, but if the underlying norms, beliefs, assumptions don't support that need for experimentation, for instance, change won't last. Because change only takes root when the deeper system can hold to it. So that's why I like the metaphor of the iceberg. First, because it reminds us that organizations are not just technical systems. They're actually emotional, relational, complex, dynamic systems. And that as a leader, you have to be looking at both things at the same time. You have to be looking for sure about what's above the waterline. You have to be thinking about your strategy, your operating model, your structure. Yet at the same time, and most importantly, you have to be attending to what's happening underneath. The team culture, the morale, all of those things that will shape how people behave. So that's also why the leader as architect that we share in the book is so powerful, because it reminds us that the most important part to manage change is to architect this invisible structure that sits underneath. Because when things get uncertain, it's not the strategy or the structure that holds teams together. It's actually the trust and the quality of relationship what sits underneath the waterline.
What's most powerful for me with what you just shared is I believe we're doing some similar work in organizations and looking at how heavily engaged organizations are with their tech stack and have put in so many different mechanisms, especially off the back of COVID, to track movement, track work, track engagement. And what we have seen is that has eroded psychological safety. that is changing the way we come in and the way we show up in the context of work. And it's so important to identify, to get under the hood, to get what's underneath the iceberg that we don't see, and gauge employee sentiment. See what's going on that's impacting your culture so that the systems that you do put in place are reinforcing what you're seeing that's happening underneath that waterline with the iceberg. So I appreciate you sharing that, because it's important that organizations are not only building the infrastructure, but understanding what's sitting underneath, because there's uncertainty that sits under that waterline that's really important to get ahead of if you are building and when you are building this type of architecture. So that actually would lead me into my next question for you is we're talking about this organizational design. And so, Lucrecia, what does uncertainty-friendly organizational design actually look like? Can you give us some practical examples that we can actually take back into the workplace to give us perspective as to what's actually happening underneath that waterline?
Yes. Of course. So first of all, I would like to say that uncertainty-friendly design is not about a new toolkit. It's not about, having lots of agile coaches. It's not about a sexy methodology that you all of a sudden want to implement. These organizations that I've been studying, and there's of course lots of research about, are the cutting edge of using uncertainty as a positive force. They don't suppress it, they don't avoid it, they actually use it and bake it into this design of the actual organization. So what does this look like in practice? Let me give you a few examples. So, for instance, some of these organizations, rather than having like the normal, usual, rigid target, they have more open-ended goals. So whilst they give people direction and, enough direction they can orient themselves, it also allows flexibility to adapt to what's emerging. So they have these open-ended goals rather than these rigid targets. They also have emergent strategies. So rather than having the usual, strategy document that is fixed on an annual plan, they have a strategy that is conceived as an ongoing conversation. So they're always in conversation, strategizing through continuous learning and reflection loops. So these organizations also have much more fluid roles. So people are not constrained by a narrow job description. They can actually play to their strengths, to their skills, and change projects and become much more malleable as talent. So these organizations have a totally way of thinking about growth and development. They don't have the usual linear career path, which is all about climbing up the ladder. They actually is about expansion and growth through different exposures, through stretch assignments, through interesting projects. So people don't have a traditional linear progression. Feedback looks quite different. It's not about the usual annual cycle. It becomes around ongoing conversations and learning cycles. So this is some of the practices that we are seeing in quite cutting edge organizations, where again, uncertainty is not an enemy to be defeated, but actually is used as a positive force baked into the DNA of the organization. And this makes these organizations much more competitive on the long run. Why? Because they are so much more adaptable to the changing environment.
Lucrecia, without that adaptability, organizations are not amenable to change. And one of the things that stuck out for me in your chapter is that you outline 4 practices that leaders must embody. I'd love for you to unpack them for us.
Sure. So these are 4 things that any leader can do right away. And this comes straight from my research where, I uncovered what are those practices that make leaders not just survive under uncertainty, but actually thrive under uncertainty. The first one has to be with being present. And by being present, I don't mean being physically present. I mean being emotionally available. In uncertain times, teams look at leaders not just for information, they look at leaders for emotional cues. So, the ability of a leader of being present, of being emotionally available, acts as a stabilizing force. It acts as a container for all of that anxiety and fear and all of the things that uncertainty triggers in all of us. And what does this look like in practice? Can be simple things like pausing before jumping into an answer. Can be things like naming what is true. This is what we know right now. This is what we don't know yet. Being honest, being transparent. Also helping people distinguish between what is signal and what is noise. This is what we know, this is what we're watching for, and these are the things that we still need to explore. So being present is the first one. The other one has to do with embracing not knowing. And this sounds easy, easier than done. It's actually really tricky for all of us. Because as leaders, we think we have to have the answers all the time. Embracing not knowing invites us to go into a space of humble inquiry, where rather than rushing into an answer, defaulting into a usual solution, we create space. Space for silence, space for other people to contribute, space for exploration before going into solution mode. And I will tell you an interesting story here, if I may. Have you heard the story about the drunk person and the lamplight? Probably not. So this is the story around a drunk person that was in the park and a policeman see them looking for something. So the policeman goes to this person and asks them, "What have you lost?" The drunk person says, "I've lost my keys." So the policeman starts helping the person, looking for the keys everywhere. So after a while he says, "Are you sure you lost the keys here?" And the drunk person said, "No, they're not here. They're over there." So the policeman asked, "But so why are we looking here?" "Well, because here we have light." And because they had the light from the light lamp. And I mean, this is very common in organizations and with all of us as leaders. We tend to look for solutions, we look for answer where the data is clear, on the things we can measure, on the things that we know. So embracing not knowing is stepping away from that lamplight, from the comfort zone, and creating that space for exploration. So being present, embracing not knowing. The other one is about building trust. And this was a key finding in my research. Trust is a shock absorber of uncertainty. It's what makes a team survive and thrive or breaks a team. And by trust, I don't mean grand gestures, polished speeches. Trust is actually built in micro moments. Brené Brown has this beautiful phrase where she says, trust is like marble jar moments. These little things, little interactions that we do on a daily basis as a leader. The check-in personally, how are you doing? The follow-up on an email. The willingness of being honest and saying conversation rather than perhaps having a vague answer that would be much easier. Micro moments compound over time and build trust. And as I said, trust is the key shocker absorber of uncertainty. And finally, the last practice has to do with engaging in generative dialogue. Most of us spend hours in meetings, right? Most of our working time is spent in meetings. And actually, meetings are discussions, which are debates in disguise. We go to a meeting with an already made answer, and we spend the entire hour just defending our position. Dialogue is different. Dialogue is thinking together. So the role of a leader is not being the smartest in the room. It's not the one to have all the answers. It's to facilitate true dialogue. How do we do that? First, starting the conversation with a question, not a statement. Second, inviting every voice in the room to participate, to contribute. Third is about inviting dissent. Divergent perspectives in complex times is exactly what you need, because in a complex world, no one holds the entire picture. All of us hold one little piece, and true dialogue is how we bring all the pieces together.
Encouraging dissent can be very difficult, especially as leaders like yourself are navigating change through complex times and complex organizations. So the 4 practices that you shared, they're deeply conceptual. I'm curious, how has this shaped you personally as a leader?
Thank you, Jen. I think that they have changed me in a quite profound way. For many years, as many leaders, I thought that my role was in having the answers, of being the one in the room that knew what to do. And to be honest with you, that's also partially the reason why I want to pursue a doctorate, to know more, to build my expertise. And actually what happened, a bit of the opposite. The deeper I went into my research, the more I worked with leaders in this messiness of organizational life, the more I understood that having the answers all the time is a complete mistake, because you become the bottleneck. And it's impossible in this complex world to have the answers to everything. So I became more comfortable in leaning into this not knowing, in saying, I don't know yet, let's explore together. Not as a weakness, but as a strategy. Because that builds the space for others to contribute. You build better teams by being this, humble sort of inquiry leader, as opposed to the one that identifies with expertise. I also believe that there's a danger with hyper-specialization and, this silo mentality that we still have in universities and in organizations, because it can narrow your point of view, right? It doesn't help you to expand what's possible. You just get fixated on what you know. So the biggest shift for me has been to be comfortable with not knowing and staying in this space where new things can emerge, better things can emerge.
The impact your chapter has had on me and as how I'm embracing change in my organization has been incredibly influential. And so my last question for you is, what key idea would you leave with leaders in an organization, specifically with CLOs who are helping to influence and drive change in these times of uncertainty?
If I can say 2 things. First, uncertainty is not a problem to be fixed. It's not something that we need to avoid or discount at all cost. Uncertainty is a condition we must embrace and design for. Why? Because the goal is not to have this world of full clarity and certainty. The goal is to create organizations and leaders that are alive, adaptive, and responsive to what's emerging in the present moment. So the role of the CLO, of the talent leader, of any leader, is actually fundamental. It's not just about building skills. It's about creating cultures, architecting the conditions where people can build trust, can explore uncertainty, and can come to better answers together, collectively. Because uncertainty is not just the absence of clarity, it's the presence of possibility.
Lucrecia, I've so enjoyed our time together today. I've enjoyed navigating through the Penn CLO program alongside you. I've really enjoyed getting more deeply entrenched in your research, learning about your contributions to this incredible body of work. And for me, most importantly, it was the takeaway so that I'm going to show up differently in terms of how I am influencing those around me and the organizations that I serve.
Thank you, Jen. It has been my absolute pleasure to be with you today, and I thoroughly enjoy our conversation. Thank you.